Good day. This is my second podcast, and I just wanted to start off with a little subject that's come up lately on inquiries from my students. A number of them have asked me, how did CSKA, that's Canadian Shotokan Karate Association, start, and where did we come from? Well, originally I was a member of the KUGB and the JKA during the 60s to 70s. I moved to Canada in 1980 and continued with the JKA under Nishiyama. His representative in Canada at that time was Jerry Ma from Winnipeg. So I quickly formed a JKA club in Calgary. It was called Shikokai. It's still called Shikokai. It was a name given to us by Toru Yamaguchi, who I brought in for a seminar at one time. I often trained with Nishiyama, going down to LA to his dojo and attending all of his summer camps in the 80s. And I did enjoy his teaching. In fact, I think he's probably he was probably one of the most technical teachers around. Sadly passed away a few years ago. Unfortunately, he was also quite political. Now, Sensei Terry O'Neill, who ran Fighting Arts magazine for a number of years, also a great film actor, good friend, he asked me if I could do an interview with Sensei Nishiyama, which I did. And the interview was published in volume 51 of Fighting Arts magazine. I continued with Nishiyama, taking my sandan with him and also attempting yondan with him at a summer camp in about 1985-86, along with a fellow Brit called Andy Holmes. We both attempted our yondan in the La Jolla camp. Now, this was a massive grading. I can't remember how many instructors were there from overseas, but I know my instructor, Sensei Hanratty, was there, Sensei Kase was there, Shirai from Italy, Sakurai from Canada, who was an instructor on the West Coast, and a number of others, Ishiyama, I believe, from Mexico. In all, there was probably 11 or 12 Japanese guest instructors at this camp. Well, the day of the grading, I'd had a little argument with a couple of the Canadian contingent that were there. Now, these people never usually showed up unless there was something in it for them politically. And what was happening was Newfoundland had brought in a representative, and they'd offered to bring in between 300 and 400 members into Nishiyama's organization. Nishiyama on the spot offered the head instructor from Newfoundland a godan, fifth dan, which I thought was a little strange. I had a friend in California at the time who I'd got on quite well with, and she went off to meet me and ended up in the Canadian guy's room from Winnipeg and Saskatchewan and this guy from Newfoundland. They were all quite drunk, and anyway, one thing led to another. I ended up going over there and taking her out of there and telling them all, behave yourselves or whatever. The next day, which was the day of the grading, Hanratty called us, myself and Andy Holmes, over to his room. Nishiyama was there, and he proceeded just to yell at us, and I didn't know where or what it was about. We didn't get a word in, somewhat out of respect and somewhat out of sheer puzzlement. But anyway, suffice to say that we were quite disheartened by this outburst. And when it came to the grading that night after the classes, the grading started at 8 o'clock in the evening, and myself and Andy Holmes, being the most senior, we didn't get on the floor until 2 o'clock in the morning. So there was 3 tables, each with 3 or 4 Japanese guest instructors on each table. So on the first table, I got up to do my kata. I remember performing unsu. Myself and Andy were going for yondan, fourth dan at the time. So I did unsu, and then, stood aside while Andy did his kata. I think he did Niji Shiho. And he's a really good kicker, nice karate man. Been a British champion and a Canadian champion, Andy, so he could do his stuff. Then the 3 instructors that were at our kata table moved up to the next table, which was basic. So we did a number of combinations as requested, kicking techniques, punching techniques, stances, stuff like that. Then they all got together and they moved up to the final table. So the final table was kumite. At this point, we were feeling pretty despondent because we didn't think that we stood a chance of passing, especially after the dressing down that Hanratty had given us earlier in the day. We thought this was just a formality. We were going through it and then they were going to say sorry. So we got to the last table and I was just getting angrier and angrier. We had no hint as to how we were doing, or if we were doing well or not doing well, or, if it was a waste of time and money. So the last table was kumite, and all of the Japanese guest instructors were sitting at the table, and I was up first against a Mexican lad. I just went at him, didn't really use a lot of control. I remember sweeping both of his legs out and pounding him. I think I'd hit him before he'd hit the floor. And he did the same. In all, we had maybe 4 fights each, and we dumped every one of them on the floor. We got yame, everybody bowed out, and we were feeling pretty bad about it all. So we go back to the room. I threw my belt on the bed, and he did the same, and we were muttering about, well, I don't know if we should pack this in or what. When there was a little knock on the door, we opened the door, and Sensei Sakurai was there from the West Coast. And he had a 6-pack of beer under his arm, put it on the table and bowed and said, that was the best grading I've ever seen. Well, this cheered us up a bit, but the next day when we inquired about the results, Nishiyama came to me and said, passed, and Andy passed. And then when we came about a month or so later, we invited Nishiyama up to Vancouver for a seminar. And I asked him, I said, if we passed, we haven't had our certificates yet. And we did send the money down to them, And he said, maybe one little thing, you have to try your kata again. And I thought, well, how do you know that? Because he didn't judge us on kata. I left it at that, and I thought, okay, well, I'll do my kata again, which I did at that seminar in New Westminster in Vancouver. And again, Nishiyama said, passed. So I was wondering what was happening because everybody seemed very reluctant to either give us the certificates or accept the fact that we'd gotten through. I got in touch with Hanratty and I asked him what was the result of the grading and how he'd enjoyed the camp. We just chatted. I always got on well with Sensei Hanratty. He was an easy man to like. Sensei Hanratty said, I'm sorry, but Nishiyama had a complaint from these guys from Newfoundland, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan that we were causing disruptions in Canada, when in actual fact the only disruption that had been caused was me going and telling them off about how they treated women. So we kind of knew where it was coming from. What disappointed me was that Nishiyama chose to take their word and not even ask me what had happened. And I found subsequently to this that there was a lot of political toing and froing with Nishiyama's group. He was always against, at that time it was WUKO and his own group, CSKA, for Olympic recognition. He was trying to say that his style of karate was entirely different from the sports style of karate, which was kind of true, and definitely it's miles different than what we have now with WKF. In fact, what I practice is very, very different from WKF karate. But it certainly disappointed me as to how the politics got involved on a personal level and interfered with something as personal and one-on-one as a grading. We carried on with Nishiyama for a number of years, up until 1989, and I phoned my sensei back in England and said, it's getting a little awkward. There's an awful lot of politics. Saskatchewan and Manitoba were dropping out of the National Association, and we were still part of the JKA at this time, under Nishiyama's group, so we were Canadian JKA. And my sensei in England mentioned that they'd formed a group called the European Shotokan Karate Association, WSKA, and they were looking at starting a World Shotokan Karate Association. So he invited me over to Ferrara in Italy to a European Shotokan final. So I attended in Italy and met a lot of old friends, Ray Dalkey, Ted Headland, Charlie Naylor. And at this meeting, we decided that we would form the World Shotokan Karate Association, so as founding members. They were looking for an initial venue for an inaugural competition, and I offered up Calgary. So we had the inaugural competition set for Calgary, and I was voted in as vice president of WSKA, and Canadian Shotokan Karate Association, CSKA, was accepted as the official body for Canada, there only being one organization per country allowed. So I went back to our group in Canada, consisting of Andy Holmes, Mike Scales, Norma Foster, Ingrid Bishop at that time. She's Ingrid Shear now. And we sat down and decided that it wasn't in our interest to stay with the Nishiyama group. We still hadn't received our Yondan certificates after 2 years. Plus, we'd had other of our students grading who'd been told they passed, and unfortunately they hadn't received their certificates, even though we'd paid for them. So we invited up Nishiyama for one more seminar in Vancouver, and we asked him out now, where were our certificates? He said, we haven't received the money. So we produced the cancelled checks signed by Aiko, who was Nishiyama's secretary. He still blustered a little bit and said, they must be in the mail. JKA have misplaced them or whatever. So we were getting a little sick and tired of this. So we called a meeting of the Canadian JKA in Montreal. We had Jerry Ma, the Saskatchewan rep, Rick Jorgensen, and Sensei Sakurai. And also in Montreal at that time, there was another Japanese instructor called, can't remember his name. Anyway, they all sat down and I gave them a list of, things that we just didn't feel was right. And it was just pushed aside. If you don't like it, then, you won't be able to get Mr. Nishiyama up for any more clinics or anything, any seminars or anything like this. You'll be out on your own. You'll be just doing your own thing. So I thought, fair enough. I'm quite sure we can do our own thing. Besides, we were confident enough that we had as good as, if not better, instructors that were behind us and a better background that we'd come from than the people who were trying to dictate to us. So accordingly, we started the Canadian Shotokan Karate Association with clubs in BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and I think there was one club in Toronto at the time. I organized the competition for WSKA in 1991 in Calgary, and we had 29 countries attending. We'd left Nishiyama at this time, and we were quite confident that we could go it on our own. The competition was a huge success, and as an inaugural competition, it was a great advert for WSKA, and I honestly felt that I was doing the right thing for myself and my students in not being dictated to from the JKA or from a Canadian group or just purely political. I still value Nishiyama's teachings. In fact, I think he was probably the most technical instructor from the JKA we had. He originally started the JKA instructor school, so he knew what he was doing. But Nishiyama was never interested in how a technique was applied. He was only interested in how much power you could generate from a technique and how to perform it correctly. But he did teach me a lot on body alignment, muscle coordination, and basically how to get your whole body moving in an efficient, rhythmic fashion that produced the most power. And it really worked. His teachings were brilliant. His political aspirations, not so much. And pushing ITKF as hard as he did left a lot of people left a lot of unpleasantness. For example, I remember competing, I think it was 1988, down in California at Nishiyama's camp. And at the end of the camp, we had a competition. We were asked to put in a Canadian team there was quite a few Quebec boys there who were really good fighters and good karateka. But the rules had been changed from our normal Shoba Whip-on JKA rules. Now you couldn't score a point with anything off the front side of your body. For example, I fought Aviroka, one of Nishiyama's top students, in fact, Izushi Deshi, which is inside student. And I managed to catch him with a front leg roundhouse kick, right in the throat, actually. And it was waved off. Nishiyama saying there was no power able to produce it. I looked to the head table, and the Noida was sitting there looking at me and just shaking his head. He couldn't believe it hadn't scored. The same thing happened with one of the Quebec boys. They had a French fighter there, Dominic Adu, who was quite famous and a really good fighter. He did a really fast Huracan to one of the American team, actually cut his eyebrow. And again, he was given no point because it was off the front hand. The other rule that really threw me was they were doing a lot of sweeps, but not a lot of follow-up. And this was because if they swept you but didn't manage to follow up, you were judged to be at a disadvantage. So your next starting point for the fight, instead of being the two lines in the center of the ring, one fighter was moved to the edge of the ring and the other fighter was moved to the closest fighting line. So you were judged to be at a disadvantage. This was called tento. I don't know where the rule came from. I don't know if they still have it. But it was kind of ridiculous. It's the same as the no power off the front hand. Obviously, these guys had never been hit with a good, strong jab from a boxer. But these were the rules that were there. And of course, the champions who'd been practicing under these rules and were quite confident that they wouldn't be scored upon from a front hand technique went and took the tournament. It was kind of enough for me at that point, and we were all ready to get out of there anyway. But there was just some of the differences. Regardless of the differences, I've always held Nishiyama in the highest regard as an instructor. I thought he was brilliant in instigating the JKA instructors program, in coming over to the States and building up the organization that he did, and in producing so many good people. He ran an instructor's course in the States. I know for a fact that Ray Dalkey, Greer Golden, Frank Smith, and all of those guys, they all went through that instructor's course. And he had the same strict rules that they had in Japan for that course. They had to show up at 9 o'clock in the morning at the main dojo in a shirt and tie, and if they weren't there, they didn't get in. They had to produce reports every month for Nishiyama to go over, and I know Ray Dalkey believes that the majority of Nishiyama's book, which he wrote with Brown, was taken from these reports, which, is quite all right by me. I mean, most professors take the students' grad work and they will put it into their own words for publishing. And the fact that he did, and he offered this course, and he produced these great instructors, Frank Smith's still going, Ray Dalkey was brilliant on the floor, an amazing instructor, produced numerous really good students. And I think these people kept on a fantastic history of traditional Shotokan karate. Just a little aside, what pushed Ray Dalkey out of Nishiyama's organization was the tour by the JKA group in 1975. 1975, Nishiyama invited over Onoida, Shirai, Kanazawa, I can't remember the rest of them, but a whole JKA group. And they were invited to fight the American team, Frank Smith, Greer Golden, Ray Dalkey, etc. Now, the American group felt that they did very well, and they were scoring points left, right, and center, but they couldn't get a point. It was also at this tournament that Sensei Onoida broke Frank Smith's jaw with a roundhouse kick. After the tournament, Dalkey told me he approached Nishiyama and said, how come we couldn't score points when it was so obvious that we were getting a lot of the techniques in? And Nishiyama replied, well, I'm sorry, Ray, but you have to understand, this is the JKA. They cannot lose face. To which Dalkey replied, well, we're the American JKA, and we can't lose face. And it was at that point that Dalkey left, and formed his own group, AJKA, which is still going today. So I hope you found this little bit of history interesting. It's personal. It's just my view of happenings and things that happened at that time. I can go into a lot more. There was a lot more going on all over the world. And unfortunately, after 87, there was a lot of sprinter groups come up after Nakayama's passing, which is a sad thing. I mean, I think we're all supposed to be doing the same thing. We should all be able to get on. Unfortunately, it's not like that. You're always going to get egos and politics involved. I wish it was different, but unfortunately it's not. Anyway, if you like this, give me a shout. And if you've got other ideas of what happened, give me a shout. But this is what I saw, and this is it from my point of view. Have a great day.